Still have a couple of people hopping in here. I'm going to manage that room, but want to thank everybody for hopping in. This is our EAPK March webinar. We're going to talk about nutrition and creep feeding, and excited to have a new face to the organization. And fortunate he's able to join us tonight, Dr. McCann from Illinois. And if you want to go ahead and talk a little bit about your background and what you do currently in Illinois, we'll go ahead and turn it over to you and get started. So we appreciate it and looking forward to what you have to tell us.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for the invitation, Cameron. I'm excited to be here with a group of sheep producers. Always fun to talk about sheep, and especially the rumen. I've never, ever turned down a request to talk about the rumen. I actually describe the rumen as kind of my happy place. So maybe that makes me strange or odd, but here we go, right? This is what you've got for the evening. So a little bit about myself here. I've actually lived in 5 different college towns. So my parents worked in the animal science field, and so I grew up in North Georgia there outside of Athens. In the second half of my childhood, I spent that in Southwest Virginia outside of Blacksburg. And so we raised sheep in both of those locations. Pretty different from the kind of Piedmont of North Georgia to the, I don't know, Appalachian Mountains, which I think we've got some probably audience in here in this group. And then from there, I did an undergraduate degree at Texas Tech University, where it's really dry and really flat, and I never met a Katahdin sheep out there, that's for sure. But did a master's in ruminant nutrition at Texas A&M, and then migrated to the Midwest to do a PhD in kind of nutrition, genomics, microbiomics, a bunch of variety of research. And since then, in 2016, I went on faculty and recently became an associate professor here at the University of Illinois. My specialty on my day job is I focus on feedlot nutrition in kind of all aspects of beef cattle production. I really like to investigate the rumen metabolism, the rumen microbiome. Really enjoy that more than the average ruminant nutritionist, as well as a little bit on precision management. So we even do some kind of, I don't know, how do we use technology in our everyday kind of production, and what's the future of those things look like for our beef production industry. So this is a lot of kind of my everyday during work, but at the same time, I'm a sheep producer. And so this is a little bird's eye view of our farm. I can afford 5 entire acres of prime central Illinois farm ground. So this happens to be, I think, the best dirt on earth. I'm not a soil scientist, but anybody can grow 200 bushel corn in Champaign County, Illinois. I think Champaign County, Illinois actually grows more corn than almost the entire state of Georgia. So it is certainly prime farm ground country here. So we have some blackface ewes for kind of market land production. So we have about 4 acres that you can kind of see we rotationally graze and kind of have a seed stock kind of a project type of operation. So I'm in the trenches every day, even though my trenches aren't real large. And this is kind of what I like to do for fun, but enjoy talking about sheep any opportunity I get. So a little bit of roadmap here tonight, what we're going to talk about. First thing we're going to cover is, what does the rumen really actually do? We're going to cover that one pretty in depth. We'll spend a lot of our time here on the rumen. And then 2, we're going to talk about how does creep feeding actually help that happen, and what are the real impacts on creep feeding on rumen development. And then 3, we'll kind of end on some implications, but we're going to leave plenty of meat on the bone. So if you guys got questions, happy to kind of delve into those things. A lot of what we know about this topic, we've learned from sheep, and we learned from dairy calves. And so we'll see some pictures here from some research studies, and we'll do more pictures than numbers, which will be good for this time of night, probably for me and for you. But this is kind of where we're going. And so if I kind of think about this presentation tonight, I might, makes me think about this road here. This is in Southwest Virginia, as you're on I-77 and you're crossing in from Virginia heading north into West Virginia. And so much like this, we're going to kind of start in the daylights. We're going to maybe get down to some dark depths of the actual rumen, and then eventually we'll see some light on the other side of the tunnel and hopefully make it through. So here to maybe get us started, got a little question for you guys. I don't have a fancy poll set up here, but for those of you listening, maybe you kind of write down at home, what do you think is the biggest driver of rumen development? I haven't taught you anything, so not going to grade this, but if you could think about, would it be volatile fatty acids? Would it be hay or hay consumption? Colonization of the rumen microbiome, creep grazing, creep feed consumption, or the age of the lamb? When we think about rumen development, which one of these do you think is the biggest driver? So you can throw that in the chat if you want, your letter of choice. I can probably see those. And if you want some, let's see, some accountability for where our knowledge level is at tonight. So let's see here. But yeah, this is really what we're going to kind of cover and hit on. And if you're really confused, then that's great. We're all going to learn something here. So when we think about what the rumen really does, let's see. It is not a trick question, all of the above. That is a good, I didn't put it on there. I do like to ask trick questions on my own exams, but I'm going to be much kinder to you guys tonight than I am to my students. So we've got age of the lamb, D, microbiome and creep feeding, E and F, and C. Okay. Some good thoughts there, and we'll kind of come back to that at the end. I don't have it on a slide, but see if I can remember my choices here. Okay. So what does the rumen really do for many people? And the most common way that we might express this sometimes is people call it a black box. I don't know if you've ever heard of that expression, just to kind of a way to explain like, well, we really don't have any idea what happens in the rumen. From a research realm, we've cannulated cattle and sheep, and I've seen cannulated moose on TV. I don't have any of those at my farm, but Larry the Cable Guy got to hang out with one in Alaska. I saw one time. But anyway, what does the rumen really do? That's what we're going to try to cover really in depth tonight here to start. And so here's a really great picture of the ruminant stomach in all four compartments. And so I asked my 8-year-old, how many stomachs does a ruminant have on the way to school this morning as I was thinking about this talk? And he's like, well, it has 4, Dad. And I was like, well, okay, well, I've got some work to do here. So our ruminants are just going to have one stomach with 4 compartments. As you're probably familiar, the rumen is going to be the largest of those. It's kind of connected side to side with the reticulum, but you can see here in the rumen, we've got this papillae, is what we would call all these like little finger-like projections that are going to cover the rumen. And the rumen is going to harbor all of our bacteria that are responsible for conducting our fermentation of the feedstuffs. And those bacteria, we're going to make all the enzymes that can digest the feed that we do not make and our ruminants do not make. And so I like to ask a question, what's responsible for breaking down the fiber in the rumen? Is it the cow's enzymes? Is it the bacteria enzymes? It's always the bacteria enzymes. The cows don't make those enzymes themselves. But once we have our feed sufficiently fermented, it's going to exit here and go to the omasum and then eventually into the abomasum. So these are our 4 compartments. The abomasum is the most like our stomach. It's really gastric, and by that I mean it has very low pH. And from there, it's going to go to the small intestine. We're going to continue a lot of the absorption and digestion of other nutrients there in the small intestine. Okay, so if we want to zoom in on the rumen, and believe me, we're going to keep zooming in on the rumen, this is kind of what a happy and healthy rumen looks like. And so we have kind of this dark color, but also a fresh, vibrant kind of tissue here of rumen. And this is coated or covered completely with these papillae. These are these finger-like kind of projections. And what they're doing is they're adding surface area to help this epithelial tissue actually absorb the volatile fatty acids that are going to get produced here in the rumen. And so this is what a really nice rumen looks like. I've got some not so nice pictures. So here's a not so pretty rumen picture. It's kind of black and it also has holes in it. And so this is kind of what's left over after we have some infection, open sores or open wounds in the rumen. Not so good looking here. Some more pictures. After those can heal up, you can leave entire scars in the rumen. And another picture of a rumen scar here as well. And so a lot of times can be involved with extreme keratinization of the rumen, also acidosis. I do tons of acidosis research. It's one of my favorite things to talk about, but we're not gonna get into that today unless we've got some questions at the end. But again, these are kind of our not so happy rumens. Now, there's kind of this expression you've probably heard like, hey, you just had one job. And it's kind of an expression I like. And maybe a picture I like of this would be a football field at a state to the north of me where the logo might not exactly be on the 50-yard line. So not exactly, there's just one job, right? Put the logo in the middle and they weren't able to execute. But if we kind of transition, we think about the rumen and talk about rumen function, the rumen has a ton of jobs to do. It isn't very simple. It has a lot of work to do. So number one, it's got to digest feed efficiently. And so what are some of the components in that feed? We've got starch, we've got protein, we've got fiber. Those are the big ones that we really need to see get digested efficiently. Second is it's got to be a barrier. So from a physiology standpoint, we consider the inside of the digestive tract technically is outside of the animal. And so we'll kind of explain that, but it also so it's going to serve as a barrier or kind of a fence. It's going to keep all of those bacteria inside of the gut. And it also has a vast immune system within the tissue of the rumen. On the rumen side, we're still learning a lot about that. Downstream in the rest of the intestines, we have learned a lot from pigs and other monogastrics about some of the role of those immune cells there. Past that, the rumen really has to absorb those volatile fatty acids. So the big ones are going to be acetate, propionate, and butyrate. These are short chain fatty acids, so 2, 3, and 4 carbons, and these are the end products of microbial fermentation. So we're going to take those anaerobic bacteria, we're going to basically feed them what the cow is eating. That's their breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And as those feeds are going to become the substrate for those bacteria, and these end products or these VFAs are going to be the energy source to the animal. And so maybe 60 to 80% of the energy that the animal gets is going to be coming from the energy in the rumen. And then these VFAs. Okay, past that, we're going to ask the rumen to actually buffer itself. And so if you've taken many animal science classes, we used to think a lot of the buffering from the rumen came from saliva. And so as our ruminants are chewing their cud, they're going to produce more saliva, and that is going to buffer the rumen. But the rumen itself is also going to buffer itself as it absorbs VFAs. We'll kind of talk about this biochemically a little bit and how some of those transporters work, but it's also one of its important functions. After that, we really need to do a good job of mixing the digestive contents. So the rumen is going to churn almost constantly, has kind of its own rhythm and its own beat. And when it does this, it's going to prevent all of the digesta in the rumen from kind of stratifying. And so this mixing is going to be a really helpful and encouragement for the bacteria that are doing the fermentation. And then last off, it's going to erect up gas. And so as it's mixing, it's also going to kind of help force the gas out. And so as a byproduct of fermentation, those bacteria are also going to produce CO2 and they're going to produce methane. And those are really important byproducts of fermentation. So methane, as you've probably heard, isn't the best for the environment. It's a whole nother side story that we could get into another day. But from a microbiome or the microbiologically speaking, Methane has 4 hydrogens. We really need to pull those hydrogens out to help drive fermentation forward. Those hydrogens kind of actually drive the pH down. And so removing those hydrogens and methane is really important for healthy rumen fermentation. And it's a pretty good indicator of healthy fermentation. If we just want to eliminate methane, but we still want a healthy rumen, that's really kind of a challenging thing to do. And so we won't kind of go down that rabbit hole too far, but a rotating gas certainly an important piece of the puzzle. Okay, so welcome to the jungle. When I think about the rumen, this is kind of the picture that I think about in my mind. And so, why do I say this, right? And so, from the jungle or the rainforest here is a pretty complex ecosystem, right? We have all of these different species, they're living in some kind of harmony together. But when I think about the rumen, I see all of these different bacteria species, whether it's a Butyrvibrio, a Ruminococcus, a Clostridium. And so we have a whole consortium of bacteria and other organisms that I'm about to talk about that are all coexisting together. They're sharing these resources or they're competing for all the resources, and the resources in this environment, that's what your lambs or your ewes ate for breakfast, right? That is the resources in this community. And so as we change the substrates, as we change the feed, the community has to adapt to that to be able to meet those needs. And so the words that I always teach my students about the rumen is that it's a competitive and it's a substrate driven community. And that means when you change the diet of what your animal is eating, you change who is in the rumen and you change what they are doing. And so that's an important component here. Okay, so we like to call this the rumen microbiome. I've been studying the rumen microbiome since 2011, which turns out now has kind of been a minute. 2011 was a good time to get into this area of research. But when we think about the rumen, we don't just have the bacteria here. We also have protozoa, fungi, and archaea that are all working together. These archaea are also what we call methanogens. And I like this picture here because this picture of a huge protozoa. On the underside, it's in kind of a synergistic relationship with all these bacteria, these little rod-like bacteria. And we also have this fungal spore. And so the way that these work together is pretty complicated. We're not going to go down this bunny trail too far tonight, but all of that to say that there's a lot that we need to learn, and it's hard to learn because a lot of these organisms are difficult to culture. And so with that, I have plenty of job security in my career. Okay, next let's jump into the rumen epithelium. So I showed you those kind of gross anatomical pictures of what the rumen papillae look like. Here's what it looks like if we cross-section those and look at them under the microscope. So we're going to call this our morphology. And so here in the picture, number one, we've got a really long singular papilla. Number two here, we've got a really short, small papillae. Number three, on the outside, you can start to see some keratinization, and we'll look at that a few different ways. Number four, we've kind of got the lamina propria. So this is some of the actual vasculature tissue there, submucosa. And then here we've got a little bit of the muscle layer. And so these are kind of what we can see from a histology perspective. These are all of the parts of our rumen epithelium. Next up, though, we're going to zoom in to essentially this small layer of cells here, and we're going to look at these different layers and think about these different cell types. So if we look at this cross-section within these rumen papillae, what we see is we have different layers of cells. So the rumen epithelium is what we called a stratified squamous epithelial tissue. Epithelial tissue just means it's kind of like your skin. So your skin would be another good example of a stratified epithelial tissue, right? So you think about your dead skin cells that eventually kind of like die and flake off. That's this outer stratocoronium layer here. But the cells are going to start as the basale layer here, and then they're going to kind of migrate up. Their function is going to change a little bit. And depending on how the rumen is and how it's functioning and how it's been developed, this layer of cells may only be 3 or 4 layers thick. It could also be up to like 15 cell layers thick. And so those things can change because the rumen and that epithelial tissue is going to be really responsive to different management and nutritional strategies. And that is what we're going to talk about tonight. So these different cell layers have different kind of functions. These on the bottom have a little bit more metabolically active. Here in the middle, these actually have what we call tight junctions. So each of these cells have some what we call like a glue or like a tight junction protein, like a desmosome, and it holds these cells together. And then eventually those corneum cells, they kind of get flat and they kind of become flaky, and they're going to be protective layer there. And so all of these things are how we keep the bacteria on the inside of the rumen from leaking into the animal. And so I showed you those leaky rumen pictures. That's what happens when we have really low pH. We have big changes in osmolality. All of these different things can kind of disrupt this epithelial tissue here, weaken these tight junctions, and allow bad things to happen and to kind of seep in to the like the bloodstream. And that's how we can get like liver abscesses. So if you're familiar with feedlot cattle, liver abscesses are a big challenge, and we think a lot of that happens and begins in the rumen. Here's just a couple more pictures that I really like. This one shows the keratinization. So this is under like a scanning electron microscope. So you can see these individual keratinized cells that are kind of flaking off there. And so that's what that looks like. And then this one has the arterial staining within a single papillae. And so you can see all of the blood flow that's really required for it to do that's absorptive capacity and all the tiny little vasculature there. Pretty cool. I like those pictures a lot. Here's kind of a cartoon of the rumen, and this is kind of what we just looked at here. The thing about the rumen is it's actually super different from the rest of the intestine, or the rest of the digestive tract that mostly is intestine. And so in our small and large intestine, it only has a single layer of epithelial cells. We call those enterocytes, and they actually do all of the work themselves. On top of those, they have a layer of kind of mucus or slime on top of that. They kind of have an inner and an outer layer that provide those kind of protection from like the acid or the bacteria. And so that mucus is kind of what does some of the same functions that all of these different cell types. And so all that to say, the rumen's just really unique. It's not like anything else in the digestive tract. And we can't just borrow what we learned from, let's say, the cecum and pigs and just kind of move that over to the rumen and assume that it's going to hold true. So as I mentioned, we're going to kind of delve in a little bit deeper here to VFA absorption and how that looks in the rumen. We kind of have two methods of absorbing VFAs. We can do that by diffusion, or we can do that by protein mediated. These are basically, essentially, I'm talking about a transporter, and that kind of depends on if the VFA is associated with a hydrogen or if it's not. You know, there's no chemistry exam here, but you know, some of those things are going to differentiate how those VFAs get absorbed. We do have a preference of VFA absorption by diffusion, and that's going to be a little bit mostly favoring butyrate and then propionate and then finally acetate. But collectively, we're typically going to have pretty similar rates of absorption. So if we are feeding our ruminants mostly hay diets, we're going to be primarily producing more acetate. If we feed them more starch or concentrates, we're going to be favoring more propionate and butyrate. We're going to talk about the consequences of that as we go. So a brief kind of dive through our transporters here. We can have lipophilic diffusion, as I mentioned. These are some of the undissociated VFAs that can get absorbed through this mechanism here. And so this would be the lumen, and this is the inside of the rumen where all the feed is. This is the basolateral here, and so we can bring in these undissociated VFAs or short chain fatty acids into here. Two, we can also use an exchange protein. And so we can bring short chain fatty acids in, and then you can see this is HCO3. This is bicarb, right? Or what we can think about as you have in your pantry as baking soda. So baking soda is a buffer, and this is one of the ways, I told you that we're going to have some buffer that comes from the saliva in the form of bicarb. We're also going to have bicarbonate or bicarb that's going to come here from these epithelial cells when we absorb VFAs. And so as we're absorbing VFAs, we can buffer that, and that buffering in a true absorptive capacity is really important. We can also have a sodium bicarb co-transporter. That's number 3 here. And so this is the third transporter that's helping the bicarb get into the cell as we're pumping sodium out. We've got 3 more transporter types here. Number 4 is also on this apical membrane, where we've got a sodium electron hydrogen exchange protein here. This is going to help maintain our hydrogen balance and promote the VFAs getting diffused. We also have a sodium ATPase, so number 5 here, that's going to pump potassium into the cell, sodium out. And then the last one is another VFA transporter. And so we have MCT1 on this, or MCT4 on this membrane, apical membrane, and then MCT1 on this other one. And that's just the gene for these transporters. And so all that to say, it's pretty complicated what we're asking this epithelial tissue to do. It's got a lot of work on both sides of the equation, is it's really trying to get all these VFAs into the animal. And remember, this is where 70% of the energy is coming through these cells so that the animal can use them. And so the fact that these are functioning properly is super, super important. Okay, so you've kind of made it through the darkest part of the tunnel, and we're going to start to move through a little bit of the light here. And we're going to talk about how creep feeding, and does it change the rumen? The short answer is yes. I think that's probably not a crazy question if you have creep fed your animals at all, but we'll talk about how it does it and in some different ways that that's actually happening. So, I like to think about this maybe in terms of a countdown, right? What is happening when we're creep feeding, or what do we need for the rumen to truly function? Because when that animal is born, they are not a ruminant. And I'll show you a little bit of that in just a second. But for this countdown to happen, and we need to have liftoff from the rumen, we've got to have our rumen. It needs to grow in size. When when that animal is born, the rumen's really small. And so first thing it needs to do, it needs to grow in size. Second, we need to have those papillae. They actually need to grow and increase the surface area. And so I showed you pictures of beautiful papillae there at the beginning for those happy and healthy rumens. That's not how it starts. It starts with no papillae. It looks like a scorched earth in the rumen. There's nothing there. And so that needs to happen to grow and develop for the papillae. And then 2, we need to have the microbial community. It really does need to mature. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this. I can talk more about it when we're done. But as you know, and you've probably been told before, right, we shouldn't change their diet overnight. It takes some time to adapt. And a lot of that adaptation is coming from the microbiome. Now, the microbiome can still adapt pretty quickly. And we'll talk a little bit about that as we go on. So as I mentioned, rumen development here. I've got a picture of a calf, but any newborn ruminant is not a ruminant. They're not a ruminant at all. Their stomach is mostly abomasum. Their rumen is really small, and that's okay. That's kind of by design, right? We know our newborns, they're not consuming very much. What are they consuming? Milk. Do we need to be fermenting milk? Not really, right? So we've got an esophageal groove, which is basically a bypass to skip out of the rumen, make it through the omasum into the abomasum, and that's where the milk digestion is really going to start to occur. Now, by the time we get to a mature ruminant, the stomach is almost all rumen, and that's because the rumen's doing a ton of work. Now, this is a process to get to there. I'm not here to tell you that we have to make this happen overnight. There are ways that we can make it happen faster. It can happen slower. That's okay. That's not a one-size-fits-all type of approach. And that's what we're going to continue to discuss here a little bit in different ways that we've learned from a few different research perspectives on how this can actually happen. So I will tell you in the middle, as that animal starts to ruminate. So Tom mentioned here before we kind of officially started the call, right? He's seen some lambs that are only, I think, 60 days old, and he's seen them chewing their cud and ruminating. So I will tell you, have the beginnings, or they have a functioning rumen. Are they a really good ruminant yet? The answer is no, right? They're on their way, they're learning, they're on the journey, but they're not really awesome yet. And those are some things that we have some implications from a nutrition and from a management perspective. Okay, I'm going to talk about this study. I think this is the only maybe real study I'm going to talk about, and it's a really classic study. Another way to say old, it was published in the 60s, and it was looking at dairy bull calves, and they wanted to just look at the effect of dietary concentrate or forage on rumen development. And I like this study. It's a huge study. I'm not going to show you very much of it, but it's old. It was done super good, well, and I like to just remind people like we've known this a long time. We've known this since the 60s in some ways. And so in this study, what they did is they took these bull calves and they assigned them to basically two treatments for 3 to 14 weeks of age. And so they either provided them a diet that was 90% concentrate, and so a balance of hay, 10% hay, or 75% hay and 25. So mostly all forage or mostly all grain from weeks 13 or weeks 3 to 14 of age. So, about 3 months, so to speak, on these treatments. And then at the end of the study, for just 3 weeks, they moved them onto a different treatment. And that was either 100% concentrate or 100% hay. And so this kind of created what we would call a 2x2 factorial, or just a 4 treatments here. And so there's kind of all 4 combinations. You have kind of grain, grain, hay, hay, grain, and then hay, or hay and then grain. And we'll look at what the impact of this was on their rumen development. So first thing we're going to look at is papillae height. And so this is how tall were those papillae. And so those animals that were on concentrate and concentrate, or grain and grain, they had the tallest papillae. The ones who were on concentrate and hay and then concentrate, they were kind of next. And then the shortest papillae were the ones that were on hay or predominantly forage the entire time. And so this here is kind of indicating grain feeding is helping accelerate rumen development. And so we'll look at that in the pictures, some classic pictures here that I like. And so here's some pictures of those bull calves. And so at the end of the study, they slaughtered them and they were able to look at their rumen development here. And so if you can kind of see this cross-section of papillae, and you can kind of see these pictures here, these ones that were on concentrate from the beginning all the way through, they had these nice, long, pretty papillae. You can see they're covering the entire rumen in a very thick, kind of dense way. The ones that were pretty much the same, except for the last 3 weeks when they were transitioned to all hay, moving them off of that grain and for 3 weeks on straight hay, you can see what that did to those papillae. Those papillae got really short. They were kind of stunted, so to speak, and they regressed. And so this is what 3 weeks kind of going backwards nutritionally can do to that absorptive capacity of the rumen and those papillae there. Next up, we're going to look at the 2 hay ones. And so both of these, you can see the papillae are shorter. They are less defined. If they were on hay the entire time, those papillae look the worst. And so we have the least rumen development here. These that are on hay and then concentrate, just 3 weeks of grain feeding really bloomed up these papillae, helped them grow, helped them develop. And I would tell you 3 weeks is kind of a minimum time frame for if you want to see a real impactful difference. 3 weeks is kind of where you need to be. These tissues, while they are very responsive, they do not respond as quickly as the bacterial populations do within the rumen. So overall, in summary here, we had some long-term and some short-term dietary changes. They both impact the rumen development in those epithelial tissues. And if we increase that concentrate feeding, it increased that surface area within the rumen. And so those VFAs are essentially acting like the fuel especially propionate and butyrate that are coming from grain feeding. Those are really the fuel for the bacteria or for the epithelium to grow and develop. Here's some pictures that Penn State has put together in their extension service, and there's a great set of pictures. These also are from dairy calves. And so here at 4 weeks of age, they have dairy calves that were fed milk and hay, milk replacer and hay. And these here that were fed milk, milk replacer, hay, as well as grain. If you can see from their rumen size, there's not huge differences in their rumen size. Some differences in color, but not huge differences. And so this would be our rumen. Here's our abomasum here. You can see those abomasums are almost, they are still pretty similar, maybe a half of the rumen size. At 6 weeks here, fed milk only, you can see the rumen isn't really growing when they're only fed milk. There's nothing physical that's hanging in the rumen that's causing that rumen to expand, so that rumen's pretty small. If you look here, fed milk and grain, this rumen has developed significantly more at 6 weeks of age. Next picture we're going to look at is at 12 weeks of age. At 12 weeks of age, these calves that were fed milk and hay have a huge rumen. These that have fed milk, hay, and grain also have a large rumen. And so we can see that what they were getting fed nutritionally didn't have a huge impact on the overall size of the rumen. At 12 weeks of age, these calves are consuming hay, and that hay is stretching out the rumen. The rumen is large. They are chewing their cud. They are functioning, they are ruminating, so to speak. And so from a size standpoint, relatively equal. But then kind of begs the question, right? We've been talking about what's happening on the inside. Well, let's look and see what was going on there. So we kind of rewind to the 6-week time frame of age. Those fed milk only in their rumen, there's really no development of the tissue here. There's no fuel from any fermentation of feed, and so we don't see that. At 6 weeks of age, the ones that are fed milk and hay, we have a little bit of development, but not very much. The ones that are fed milk and grain, we've already starting to see some robust papillae development. They're short, but man, we've got a big difference in just the 6 weeks of life. Next up, here's just a little bit bigger picture, a little bit later on. The ones fed milk and hay, we can see we don't have that much development of our epithelial tissue. Those ones fed grain, we have a much more robust growth there. And I like this picture. They kind of just did 4 weeks with fed milk and grain, 12 weeks, no grain, right? Even as that animal is getting older, that rumen is not developing unless they're eating something, right? And we have some fermentation. And unless we're consuming grain, we're really slowing down that rumen development process. Now, I mean, I'm not here to tell you that it has to be fast, but if we want our production goals to be fast, then we do want to think about accelerating our rumen development, and creep feeding can help us do that. So, implications. So what should we do? What are some of the options that we can think about here? So this is a little bit philosophical. I didn't dig through a ton of data. We didn't want to get too deep in here tonight, but I'll just start off by saying there's no one way. Age, feed, management, there are a variety of things that can work. Overall, our goals should be number one. I like to say our lambs should be rumen ready whenever we wean them. If you're weaning early, you're weaning normal, late, however we want to call that, we want their rumens to be well prepared when we do wean them. For me, that's kind of an accelerated process. I'm in the Midwest. My feed stuffs are pretty affordable. So, and I'm trying to sell them as market lambs. They need to be bloomy. And unfortunately, we sell market lambs at like 8 to 10 weeks of age these days. So I'm asking them to go pretty fast. But obviously, that's not everybody. And then secondly, we want our creep feeding philosophy to really match our production and marketing objectives of your operation, which should and do vary quite a bit. So we're going to work through a few options here. Option one is what I call all gas, no brakes. In this situation, we've got early weaning. So I'm talking about probably 10 weeks or less of age, or at least 12 weeks of lesser age. And we're going to probably try to market them early, whether that's in the production market, to a seed stock market, to any market. We want to get them sold at a young age. And then we're willing to invest more money or more dollars in feed and in infrastructure. Depending on your location, for me, that means, yeah, I need a barn, need a creep pen. And I need to actively bed that barn because it's the wintertime in the Midwest. I can have a very damp barn very easily. I can have coccidity issues very easily. And so those things are just higher input from a management standpoint of my time and my resources. Keys to success here, they need to have early access to this. So 10 days or less, they need to have access to creep. That creep feed needs to be highly palatable, needs to be very digestible, and the protein quality needs to not only have a lot of protein, but the quality of that protein needs to be good. When I say quality of protein, I'm talking about the amino acid balance. And so something like soybean meal, roasted soybeans, those things have a really good amino acid balance. So having those as part of a creep meal, a creep feed can be highly desirable. So different feedstuffs that work really well. Alfalfa is going to be the most palatable feed for a young lamb, right? I can take some high quality alfalfa and those lambs are going to eat those leaves all day long. In our situation with my small boys, we like to take a little alfalfa leaves, sprinkle it on the creep feed. We like to call those sprinkles. And that's kind of the boys' job to put some sprinkles on the creep feed. That helps those lambs get familiar and put their head in the creep feed and start to consume and start to nibble on that. At the beginning, those lambs are going to be super picky. Other than alfalfa, the thing that I find our new lambs liking the best is actually cottonseed hulls. So those are just a byproduct from the cotton industry. They don't really have a lot of nutritional value other than that the fiber's digestible. The lambs like to eat them. They like to eat them. Then they're going to eventually start eating everything else within the creep feed. That's what I find they sort out first. Other great things to include in a creep feed are soybean meal, oats, molasses definitely improves the palatability. Highly processed corn also works as well. And so overall, here's a picture of my creep feed. So I took this morning at the barn. And so there's a mixture. We've got some soy hull pellets. There's a protein pellet in here that also has some decox in that as well. There's some corn gluten feed pellets. And so a good mixture of things. This works really well. This year, it's only cost me $15 a bag for a 50-pound bag of creep feed, which I think is very affordable. But again, I'm in the Midwest. My feeds and my corn is cheaper than many people. Option two, I'm going to call it low and slow. These are for folks if you're lambing later in the calendar year on grass. If you are weaning later, I'm talking about 16 weeks and older. And if your production is forage, this might be a creep feeding philosophy or a strategy that works for you. And so when I say creep feeding here, it might be, or I think about rumen development, things that are going to help you be successful is making sure that your lambs and ewes have access to high quality pasture. So if you want to go low input, that can work. You just want to make sure that your pasture quality is desirable and that you have a sufficient stand of that, right? Because as we know, I'm sure as y'all talked about on the parasites, if you've been hanging out with Cameron too long, right? As we graze down closer to the ground, we're going to have a greater chance of ingesting parasite eggs and getting those things started, and our little lambs are going to be the most susceptible to that. And in this situation, if we're not providing any protein, we don't have as much fuel for the immune system to really combat that as good as we do in a maybe a more typical creep feeding situation. Here, I would tell you, you need to really be patient with your growth and your weight goals. So it is fine to do it this way. You just don't want to have the same goals as your neighbor who's spending lots of money on creep feed and asking them to gain weight very quickly. And then you want to make sure to slowly transition to them to grain after weaning, or if you want to give them some creep right before, you want to make that transition slow and steady because the rumen needs to adjust over time and the microbiome needs to adjust over time. So you can't really rush that. Option three, I'm going to call it the best of both. And so I know a lot of Katahdin breeders are still on more forage-based production systems. And so if you take some kind of creep feeding setup like here, where you're able to creep feed on pasture as early as you want, this is going to be desirable if you want to market your lambs soon after weaning. You want to make sure that you still have high quality pasture because your lambs are going to be alongside the ewe. They're going to have to seek out this creep feed, and so their intake is going to be a little bit slower. And in this situation, and in all creep feeding situations, I would say you really want to make sure your creep feed is cost effective on an annual basis. So on the beef side of things, beef calves, because we wean them so much later, typically 6 to 7 months of age, those beef calves, if we want to give them free choice access to a creep feed, they can eat us out of house and home. And creep feeding can become very uneconomical in those situations. And so in those situations, sometimes we can actually put salt in there as a limiter, as like 10% of the diet, just to make sure those animals don't overconsume. So all at the same time, right, making sure this pencils and makes sense for your strategy and what you're able to do. So as we kind of tie things together here, I would tell you that rumen function is really the key to a healthy ruminant. The rumen is kind of where it all happens. It's responsible in making sure this developmental process happens appropriately for our production goals is really key. Now, creep feeding grain is the key to faster rumen development. So for that question, what is the key to accelerating this? The key is volatile fatty acids, and that's specifically going to be butyrate and propionate. Those are the key. And so I don't know if anyone put A for their answer, but A is the best answer for that. The microbiome, it's going to change over 7 to 14 days. That's kind of what it needs to adjust. And so wherever you're starting, that is one of the key things to think about. That epithelium is going to take a little bit longer to adjust. I would say 14 to 21 days, maybe even up to 28 days, that it's going to take to truly see a response. As we saw in that one study, 3 weeks though of shifting the diet where we didn't have as good a fermentation really can hurt and make the epithelium kind of go backwards. And then overall, really, creep feeding should match your production goals. So there's not one way to do this. Everyone has different goals on how they want to get their lambs marketed. And so making sure your strategy, if you want to, sell them earlier, you want to sell them heavier, you want to sell them at a younger age, creep feeding is a great way to do that. And obviously that's because it fosters a faster, more accelerated rumen development. So with that, that's a little bit on rumen development and creep feeding, and we'll be happy to take some questions.
Appreciate it, Dr. McCann. If you've got questions, feel free to drop those in the chat or come off a mute and ask them yourself. I've got one to start us off. Really appreciated the study that you presented. That's not new, but on the papillate growth, the is there a why to the grain diet promoting the height? Because those were, I don't know if they were statistically significant, but just from the pictures, I mean, you could see them with the naked eye. Why
Yes.
is it that grain is creating that difference in those the heights inside the rumen?
Yep. Great question, Cameron. And so, there's lots of stats in that paper, and we didn't go through those things. But those end products of fermentation, so butyrate, ends up being the fuel for that actual tissue. And so if we think about, maybe there is 100 millimoles kind of concentration of BFA in the rumen. About, I don't know, 10, maybe say 8 to 15% of that is butyrate. Most of that butyrate actually never leaves the rumen tissue once it gets absorbed. That butyrate ends up being the fuel for that tissue. And so once that butyrate is being produced, then that tissue starts responding. When we are consuming, or when that animal is consuming more hay, that butyrate percentage is going to be really low, and it's really not enough to fuel that rumen papillae growth and development there. So that fermentation of grain and how that changes those fermentation end products, that's the fuel for the papillae growth.
Yeah, I mean it's literally fuel on the
Yes, it
fire.
is the
That's
fuel.
yeah, that is fascinating. I'm glad I asked. That's incredible. Got a question here in the chat. At what age can lambs start to get sick if feed is changed too quickly?
So great question. I'll tell you any age. Okay. So any age of a lamb, if we change their feed too quickly, they can get sick. When we're making changes to the diet, we want to do those slowly, do those gradually, and we don't want to do those with other stressful events. And so we can see, when we have a young lamb, if we're in a confinement setting, we can have coccidia risk. We have castration. We have weaning. We can have transportation. All of these are stress events. And so we want to separate changing the diet as a stress event. And so when we are changing these things, we want to change them. We want to separate the stress events and change them slowly. And so it depends, right? If you want to change from one creep feed to another creep feed, their formulations might not be crazy different. You could probably do that in 3 to 5 days. The other factor, though, is what's your intake of those lambs? How much are they eating? Um, and so the higher your intake, the greater the opportunity of a diet change. So let's say they have free choice hay and the hay is delicious. And they have, I don't know, let's just call it a commercial bag creep feed that they don't really love, or they've only been eating it a couple of weeks and they're not really eating very much at all. Um, and so with that, if you change the creep feed, they're not eating very much. It's not going to have a big effect. Today, I weaned my lambs last weekend, and they're less than 50 pounds. They're almost eating more than 2 pounds a lamb a day. They're eating a ton. Any little change in their diet or little change, let's say I underfeed them and then overfeed them, big changes in intake they can make them all go loose, right? And give them all diarrhea. And so they're more sensitive to those changes at higher levels of intake for sure.
Get another question here from Barry. Does grass have a similar effect as hay on rumen development in our lambs? And then give some background here. I'm putting my ewes and lambs out on pasture now. Should the lambs still have access to hay for rumen development? Because his ewes will not eat the hay now that they've got fresh grass.
Yeah, that's a great question, Barry. I would say the impact of fresh grass, and hay is pretty equivalent on rumen development. So it's going to increase rumen size, but it's not going to increase those papillae growth and that absorptive capacity of the rumen. And so if your lambs have access to obviously, if you're using on pasture, your lambs have access to that as well. And so your lambs are probably already eating the most tender grass. And so there's no necessity to provide hay to those lambs. They'll already be consuming some grass. How much they're consuming? I would say as much as they want. And so there is I guess, some balance and it's good for those lambs that are not weaned to be consuming grain and grass or hay at the same time. There's some work that's been done on that. I'd say overall it's synergistic and a positive thing to have, and pretty almost going to happen by default in any situation that we're looking at from a production standpoint. So we have been doing some cow research on this at the University of Illinois. So we have we like to put cows in confinement in the Midwest because grass is expensive. And so we've learned that as well, that even though we're slowing down rumen development, if those animals don't have access to a lot of creep feed or a lot of the cow feed, they can still catch up and adapt pretty quickly.
And Barry did share he is still going to creep feed those lambs on pasture, which, from that papillae, study. I think
Yep.
what you've said this entire presentation is that's going to help quite significantly in that rumen development. The other question I would tack on to the end of that,
Mhm.
when we get into these, lush spring forages, what's the impact of that higher water content in our fresh grass versus an increased dry matter in our hay? How does the rumen deal with water and what happens inside when that's the case?
Yeah, that's a good question. That's a question that doesn't get researched as much. Um, Nobody's really paying for studies on water too much, but they pay for studies on feed and some of those things. But it is a concern, and we talk about, I don't know, here in the Midwest, some people like to use the word like washy kind of forages because the dry matter content can get so low. And on cows, we think about it being a problem because they have a problem consuming enough quantity of grass. I don't think that's really an issue on lambs and rumen development. For lambs, they're consuming more water. They're not really going to be I think one of the benefits for lambs and rumen development when you're on pasture is you don't need as much water access. So for me in the barn, if I want my lambs to really take off on creep feed, I've got to provide a separate water source for those lambs that's extra clean and that they can actually reach so that they can get their creep feed intake to increase. And so I also have to clean that out like nearly every day because they're just really little lambs and they're picky about those things. On pasture, they're going to be able to consume more water in the forage to kind of support that creep intake, even though they might not be able to consume the water out of the out of the water trough that the ewes are drinking. And so I think it's really more of a benefit in that situation. Generally, there's probably some substitution effect. Those forages, um, those lambs are only going to consume small bites of forage. They're not really going to be great at chewing their cud. And so I think like that kind of one picture I showed of that animal that had only had milk and hay, that rumen was full, but the community of microbes that it takes to digest the fiber in that, it takes a while to mature. A young rumen that is functioning as a rumen isn't very good at digesting forage because that forage needs to be pretty high quality. It's just not very good. That microbial community takes time to digest. So there's been some cool research where they stomach tubed calves that haven't been weaned or just about to be weaned, and they were eating a little creep feed and eating grass out there on the pasture. But in those situations, their microbial community wasn't very good at digesting the forage compared to the cow's rumen community. That cow's microbial community had matured and developed over a much longer period of time and was really good at digesting forage. So even though those lambs and those calves are out there eating the grass, they're not really able to access all of those nutrients as completely as the cow is. Even if, they're not as good as chewing their cud, their jaws aren't as strong, the microbes are not as mature and robust either. So.
Awesome. Get another question here from Kathy. Does it help to offer creep feed to lambs for the first 6 weeks if they will then be transitioned to grass once pastures are ready to graze? They're weaning at about 90 days and lambs will finish on grass. And so, based on the question, only feeding creep for those first 6 weeks. And then is that enough to get that rumen developed so that, like what you were just saying, that community is able to really kick it into high gear to digest that fiber?
I think the answer to that is yes. It's going to help. Depending on how aggressive you are and when those lambs get marketed, like how long is it taking them to finish on pasture? You told me it's taking 2 months. Okay, the benefit of creep feeding is going to be big. If you're telling me it's 4 to 6 months to get those lambs to finish to where you want them to be at their harvest weight, then the impact of creep feeding of that long term, I think is going to kind of diminish over time. And so, absolutely, creep feeding is going to help those rumens be more robust and more developed by the time they go to pasture. And that's a good thing. But the longer they're on pasture and the longer it normally takes to get them to your ideal market weight that you want to actually slaughter them, you're going to see diminishing returns of that. Um, at the same time, like they're going to be a bigger, healthier lamb. They're probably going to be more robust. They're going to be larger. Their immune system's probably going to be more developed. Probably just going to have a little bit more fuel there. So as you're turning them out to pasture, they're going to start to see parasites for the first time. You might just buy yourself a little bit of margin and health that way. So it might not all, it's not all rumen development. There's more pieces of the puzzle there. And so you might just buy yourself a little safety margin when you turn those fresh weaned lambs out onto pasture and they start to see parasites.
Awesome. That's all we have in the chat. Does anybody else have any questions? Again, feel free to come off mute and ask. Barry threw another one here in the chat. If we are feeding creep anyway, do you recommend adding pre and probiotics to help rumen development? If we're adding, do you recommend adding bicarbonate or offering it free choice?
Those are good questions. I haven't really delved into a lot of pre and probiotic work. There's certainly a lot of work on the calf side of it. Um, I don't think and most of the times it doesn't hurt. I don't really like to group them all in the same category, but in general, if I do want to generalize some of the pre and probiotic work, it's more helpful on younger animals and it's more helpful on stressed animals. And our lambs pre-weaning probably fall into that category. And so there's probably more opportunity for it to help them than other situations. One of the things I didn't talk about, but I think is a really cool thing, is the best probiotic that we have for our lambs is colostrum. And so most everyone knows that, colostrums are the source of antibodies, but colostrum has dozens of other bioactive compounds that truly shape that microbial community for that lamb's life. And so good colostrum quality and good colostrum intake benefits the entire gut for the lifetime of those animals. And so I think that's really cool. I've learned a lot about that in the last couple of years. I know there's one supplement on the market now that you can kind of give to lambs anytime they're not feeling so great, and it has basically bovine colostrum in there. They're not going to get the antibodies, but they're going to kind of reset the gut community to be a little healthier. So I think there's some opportunities there, but I would say anytime that you want to speed things up, or if what you see you're having issues with diarrhea, and they're getting loose and they're not firming up in terms of their stool, those are things that you can think about. Oh, well, maybe a prebiotic could kind of help in this situation. Maybe that's reducing the coccidia load in the barn or the environment. So for me, that looks like bedding very aggressively. For me, that looks like putting Bovatec in my U ration to decrease coccidia loads in the barn. So, there's a couple different ways to go about it. Everything, it all costs money. And so it kind of just depends.
And you bring up a good point there on using creep feed. Yeah, you get all the rumen development, but as a vessel to deliver some of those products that are preventing toxicity or some issues there. So I think that if you've dealt with it before, it's not a lot of fun, and you try to prevent versus treat in those situations.
Yeah.
We've got another question here. Are there any health advantages to an all grass-fed lamb that comes from the rumen development being slower or less? So is there a health advantage, I'm assuming, to the lamb that their development is slower from being all grass-fed?
I would say no. I don't think there's any true rumen advantage. Now, that situation, let's say we're taking a creep-fed lamb, we're moving them into a feedlot situation where they're entirely finished on grain. Well, that situation has some risk of acidosis. has some, other health risks that can kind of come along with that, can be managed. So I'm a feedlot nutritionist. So this is kind of like what we manage every day when we're finishing beef cattle on a, 90% grain kind of diet. So those things can be managed, and there's some more risk there compared to a situation where you're just finishing all on grass. You're finishing all on grass, there's really no risk, or very minimal risk, so to speak, for most lambs and for most sheep. So, but
Yeah,
you obviously just have slower production, right? You're not going to reach the same weight goals, and that's fine.
yeah, and I think you go back to um, your second. It was number two on the Rumen has multiple jobs slide, and the barrier defense to have that immune system. When you look at in my mind, we're so focused on rumen tied to nutrition that I think a lot of times we forget that that is like the first point of contact of foreign entities entering into the body. And so just from that alone, I want to develop that as quickly as possible, because what does it mean for long-term fitness of that animal on what they're able to prevent when they're already exposed to so much. So Barry's got another question here: Bovatech versus Decox? Question mark.
Yeah, good question. So I typically would use Bovatech in ewe feed and lamb feed after weaning. At some point that they move on to more of a lamb feed and off of a creep feed. Decox is pretty much what you're going to find in all creep feeds. On the majority of medicated creep feeds. No, it's not. You can certainly get a creep feed without Decox. But I don't think you're gonna hardly see one. And so I've never fed Bovatech in a creep feed. The thing about decox is it's a coccidiostat. It's not coccidiocidal. And so decox isn't going to kill any coccidia that they have in their gut. It's going to prevent new coccidia from taking up residence. And so that's one of the things for me, like getting some creep intake early is really key, because I'm going to help prevent coccidia colonization as early as I can. Whereas if like, oh, you're in a situation where like, oh, I'm just going to creep feed the last 3 weeks before I wean, or just a little bit before weaning to kind of help them move from there, then they've already got some exposure to coccidia, and most certainly in any barn environment. And you shouldn't expect your coccidia to do all of the heavy lifting in those situations. You probably should have to come through with something like Corid, or something like that, or a sulfa, to kind of work on the coccidia if that's something you're having issues with. Especially, normally after weaning is like, oh, we see it's there, it's not really causing problems. Oh, we wean them, there's some stress. That coccidia is now like, ooh, there's an opportunity here. And that's when we see those issues happening.
Great. Well, I do not see any other questions in the chat. Again, if you've got this, your last call. Last call for questions. Come off mute and ask it. If not, got a lot of positive comments. I will let you know that Dr. Bowdridge is in the chat. He was excited you mentioned both parasites and colostrum. So the two big takeaways. So
Yeah, I
I
learned a
feel
lot
like
about
we can't.
parasites from
Yeah.
Dr. Bowdridge, and yeah, I like to enjoy talking about it. But we just talked about the rumen today, so that's okay with me.
Yep. Yeah. Awesome. So appreciate it, Dr. McCann, and everybody have a good evening. Look forward to reviewing. I personally look forward to reviewing the recording and filling in the gaps I have in my notes here. So I appreciate it, and I know the group appreciates it. Have a good evening.
Awesome, thanks.